The Full History of America, Part 1. The history of America stretches back far before the creation of the United States in 1776, far before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, and even before the rise of the great native civilizations that once flourished across the continent. To truly understand America, one must begin in the deep past, when the first humans set foot upon the vast lands of the Western Hemisphere during the last Ice Age, embarking on one of humanity's greatest journeys. The land that would one day be called America has been home to countless peoples, cultures, and civilizations, each leaving their mark upon its soil and shaping the destiny of what would become the modern nation. Tens of thousands of years ago, during the Ice Age, sea levels were lower, and a land bridge known as Beringia connected Siberia with Alaska across what is now the Bering Strait. It was across this bridge, between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, that the ancestors of Native Americans gradually migrated into North America. Following herds of mammoths, bison, and other Ice Age animals, these early hunter-gatherers spread out across the vast landscapes of the continent, adapting to every environment they encountered, from the frozen tundra of the Arctic, to the forests of the Northeast, to the deserts of the Southwest, to the fertile valleys of the Mississippi and the Great Plains. Over time, they diversified into hundreds of tribes and nations, each with its own language, traditions, and way of life. This was the first America, an America of immense cultural richness long before Europeans ever arrived by around 5000 BCE. Many native communities had transitioned from purely hunting and gathering to agriculture, cultivating maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters crops that sustained numerous civilizations. This agricultural base allowed the rise of large settled communities, ceremonial centers, and trade networks that stretched across thousands of miles. Long before the United States existed, America was a land of thriving civilizations that rivaled those of the Old World in complexity, ingenuity, and spirit in the Southwest. The Ancestral Puebloans, once called Anasazi, built remarkable stone and adobe dwellings in the cliffs and canyons of modern-day New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. Their homes, such as those preserved at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, were feats of engineering and adaptation to the harsh desert environment. These people constructed kivas, ceremonial chambers for spiritual life, and irrigated their crops through intricate canal systems. They were part of a long cultural continuum in the desert Southwest, which included the Hohokam, famed for their irrigation canals in Arizona, and the Mogollon, people with their distinctive pottery. Farther east, in the fertile river valleys of the Midwest and Southeast, the Mississippian culture flourished between 800 CE and 1600 CE. Its largest city, Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, was once home to tens of thousands of people, making it larger than many European cities of its time. Cahokia's people built enormous earthen mounds, some of which still stand today, that served as temples, burial sites, and platforms for elite leaders. At its peak, Cahokia was a hub of trade and culture, linking societies from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The sheer scale of its achievements demonstrates that pre-Columbian America was anything but empty land. It was instead a landscape of vibrant urban centers and complex political systems in the Northeast. The Iroquois Confederacy, known to its members as the Haudenosaunee, united several nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, into a powerful league. Governed by a sophisticated council system, Confederacy maintained peace among its member tribes and provided a model of representative governance that would later influence European settlers and even the framers of the U.S. Constitution. The Iroquois emphasized balance, consensus, and the authority of clan mothers, reflecting a system where democracy and social cohesion were deeply ingrained. On the Great Plains, nomadic tribes such as the Lakota, Blackfoot, and Comanche developed cultures centered on hunting the vast herds of bison that roamed the prairies. Although horses were not introduced until Europeans arrived, these societies had already developed rich traditions of warfare, spiritual practices, and communal life. Their songs, oral histories, and sacred ceremonies, such as the sun dance, reflected a worldview intimately tied to the rhythms of nature and the cycles of the land to the north. The Inuit and Aleut peoples adapted to life in the Arctic, building igloos, hunting seals and whales, and crafting ingenious tools from bone and stone. Their ability to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth speaks to the resilience and creativity of America's first peoples. Across the continent, spiritual traditions flourished. Native peoples believed in a world alive with spirits, where animals, plants, rivers, and mountains carried sacred power. Ceremonies, dances, and stories were central to maintaining harmony between human communities and the natural world. Oral traditions preserved history, law, and culture across generations, ensuring that the wisdom of ancestors would never be lost. Thus, before Columbus ever set foot in the New World, the land that would one day become the United States was already old with memory, rich with civilization, and alive with diverse peoples who had made it their home for millennia. This was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a continent full of nations, cultures, and histories. The arrival of Europeans would forever alter this world, bringing both devastating loss and profound transformation. The History of America, Part 2. The arrival of Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked a profound turning point in the history of the land that would become the United States. For millennia, native civilizations had thrived independently. But with the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and those who followed him, America was suddenly thrust into the orbit of European empires, commerce, and conflict. What began as exploration soon gave way to colonization, conquest, and cultural transformation, reshaping the destiny of the continent in ways both creative and destructive. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached islands. Near Asia, his voyages sparked a wave of European exploration. The Spanish were the first to establish themselves in the New World, pushing northward from Mexico into what is now the southwestern United States. They founded settlements in Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, bringing with them Catholic missionaries, soldiers, and settlers. Spanish explorers, such as Hernando de Soto, roamed through the southeast, while Francisco Vázquez de Coronado marched through the Great Plains in search of mythical cities of gold. Although their hopes of discovering El Dorado were disappointed, Spanish established missions and forts, leaving behind cultural legacies that endure in place names, architecture, and religion across the American Southwest. The French, too, sought their fortune in North America. They explored the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes, and the lands of Canada. The French built relationships with native peoples through the fur trade, exchanging European goods for beaver pelts and other animal furs that were highly prized in Europe. Settlements like Quebec, Montreal, and New Orleans became centers of French influence. Unlike the Spanish, who often sought to dominate native populations, the French frequently relied on alliances, intermarriage, and trade, though they too reshaped the balance of power among indigenous nations. For tribes such as the Huron and the Algonquin, alliances with the French brought both advantages and new vulnerabilities in the centuries of European conflict to come. The English, however, would leave the deepest mark on the lands of what is now the United States. Their first permanent settlement, Jamestown, Virginia, was founded in 1607. It began with hardship, disease, and starvation, but survived through perseverance and the cultivation of tobacco as a cash crop. The tobacco economy demanded intensive labor, and although indentured servants from Europe were initially used, the system soon turned toward the enslavement of Africans. Thus, from its very beginnings, English America carried within it the seeds of both democracy and inequality, liberty and bondage. A few years later, 1620, another group of settlers, the Pilgrims, established a colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Unlike the Jamestown colonists, who were motivated largely by economic opportunity, the Pilgrims sought religious freedom. They drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement for self-government, which has often been seen as a forerunner of American democratic traditions. Other religious groups, such as the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, Quakers in Pennsylvania, and Catholics in Maryland, also founded colonies where they hoped to practice their faith without persecution. Thus, diversity of belief became one of the early hallmarks of English America. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the English colonies expanded along the Atlantic seaboard, forming 13 colonies stretching from New England in the north to Georgia in the south. Each region developed its own character. New England became a land of small farms, town meetings, and maritime trade. The middle colonies, such as New York and Pennsylvania, were notable for their diversity and bustling ports, while the southern colonies developed plantation economies dependent on enslaved African labor to produce tobacco. By the mid-18th century, slavery was deeply entrenched, with hundreds of thousands of Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the brutal Middle Passage, forever altering the demographic and cultural fabric of America. The colonies were not isolated outposts, but part of a global network of commerce and empire. Goods flowed across the Atlantic in the so-called triangular trade. European manufactured products were shipped to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas, and raw materials like sugar, cotton, and tobacco were sent back to Europe. The wealth of empires was built upon these exchanges, but the human cost was immense, especially for the enslaved who endured unimaginable suffering. Despite their dependence on Britain, the colonies developed a growing sense of independence. Local assemblies managed many of their own affairs, and colonists cherished their rights as Englishmen. Yet tensions with the mother country were never far from the surface. By the mid-1700s, competition among European powers in North America erupted in the French and Indian War, 1754-1763. Part of the wider 7 Years' War between Britain and France, the war was fought on American soil with Native American tribes often choosing sides according to their own interests. Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of French Canada and vast new territories, but the war was costly to pay for its expenses. The British government began imposing new taxes and regulations on the colonies. These measures, including the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Tea Act, provoked outrage among colonists who argued that they were being taxed without representation in Parliament. Taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Protests spread, and resistance grew more organized, with groups like the Sons of Liberty leading boycotts and demonstrations. The situation escalated into violent clashes, such as the Boston Massacre of 1770, which British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing several colonists. And the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when protesters dumped British tea into the harbor in defiance of taxation. The British government responded with harsh measures, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These only deepened colonial unity and resistance. Delegates from across the colonies convened the First Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate their opposition, marking a step toward intercolonial cooperation. Tensions finally erupted into armed conflict in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, often called the opening battles of the American Revolution. Farmers and townsmen, the Minutemen, stood up against the world's greatest military power, and the struggle for independence had begun. In 1776, the Continental Congress took the bold step of declaring independence, drafted largely by Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words, though imperfectly applied in a society that still sanctioned slavery and denied rights to women and Native Americans, nevertheless set forth ideals that would inspire not only Americans but peoples around the world for centuries to come. The Revolution was long and bitter. The colonial army, led by George Washington, faced immense hardships against the professional forces of Britain, yet the colonists persevered, aided by support from France, which saw in America's struggle a chance to weaken its old rival, Key. Victories at Saratoga in 1777, in Yorktown in 1781, turned the tide, and finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. A new nation had been born, one that carried within it both the promise of liberty and the contradictions of inequality, both the aspirations of democracy and the legacy of conquest. The stage was set for the unfolding of America's unique experiment in self-government, expansion, and identity.